Welcome to the world of legendary voyages and brave explorers. Tonight, we begin to unravel the epic voyage of Magellan's Circumnavigation, a story of ambition, peril, and discovery that spanned the entire globe. Now, settle in and get yourself truly comfortable. Find your favorite armchair, maybe tuck a soft blanket around your shoulders. Let your eyelids grow heavy. That's right, just let them rest for a moment. Where are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it for you? Is it the quiet hush of evening, or perhaps the early start of a brand new day in your perfectly organized, or maybe wonderfully chaotic part of the world? We're so glad you're here with us. If you enjoy these journeys into history, consider subscribing so you don't miss a single port of call in our grand adventure. Our tale begins not on the waves, but in the gilded halls of the Spanish court, where the seeds of a daring plan were sown. A plan to sail west and reach the fabled East, a journey that would forever change how we see our planet. King Manuel, his fingers tracing the worn vellum of a chart, felt a prickle of resentment. For years, Portugal had dominated the sea lanes, its caravels venturing where few dared. Yet the whispers from the Indies spoke of riches untold, of spices that could transform a kingdom. And now a Portuguese captain, Ferdinand Magellan, was presenting a bold, audacious plan to the Spanish crown. It spoke of a westward route, a path to the very lands Portugal claimed as its own. A bold stroke that Manuel had dismissed as a fool's errand, a slight that chafed like a poorly mended sail. This ambition, however, found fertile ground across the border in Seville, where Emperor Charles V, young and eager to forge his own legacy, saw a chance to outmaneuver his rivals and claim a share of the world's most precious commodities. In Seville, the air buzzed with a different kind of energy, a palpable thrum of opportunity and intrigue that contrasted sharply with the gilded halls of Lisbon. Here, under the Spanish sun that warmed the stone buildings, Ferdinand Magellan, a man whose keen eyes held the glint of distant stars and the vastness of the uncharted ocean, presented his meticulously prepared proposals. He spoke of celestial navigation, of currents understood, and of a passage that could redefine the known world, all while feeling the weight of his Portuguese heritage pressing upon him, a constant reminder of the nation that had cast him aside. The Spanish court, a tapestry of shrewd advisors and ambitious nobles, listened with a mixture of skepticism and avarice, their minds calculating the potential profits and the glory that such a venture promised. The whispers of disapproval, however, were not confined to Portugal. They echoed faintly even in the corridors of Spanish power. Some of the seasoned captains, men who had sailed under the Spanish flag for years, felt their own claims to leadership overlooked, their expertise overshadowed by this foreigner with his grand vision. They saw the massive undertaking not just as a quest for wealth, but as a matter of national pride, a contest between kingdoms played out on the grandest stage. Magellan, acutely aware of these undercurrents, understood that his success depended not only on navigating the seas, but also on skillfully maneuvering through the complex web of loyalties and rivalries within the Spanish administration, each decision a delicate balance of ambition and diplomacy. The court was a place of shifting allegiances and carefully chosen words, where a subtle nod could signal approval and a raised eyebrow could signify fatal doubt. Magellan, however, possessed a singular focus, his mind already charting courses across hypothetical oceans, his spirit ignited by the challenge. He saw the lucrative potential of the Spice Islands, the islands that produced the cinnamon, cloves, and pepper that were worth more than gold in Europe, and he believed he had found the key to unlocking them for Spain. This belief, born of years spent studying maps and winds, and perhaps fueled by the sting of Portuguese rejection, gave him the conviction to press his case, his voice steady as he painted a picture of a world expanded and fortunes multiplied. The emperor, a young man with a keen understanding of how such expeditions could bolster his growing empire, listened intently, his gaze sharp. He saw not just a Portuguese sailor, but a man with the intelligence and drive to achieve what others deemed impossible. He understood the geopolitical implications of controlling the spice trade, the immense power and wealth it represented. The Spanish crown, unlike the Portuguese, seemed willing to embrace this audacious plan, recognizing the potential to disrupt the established order and secure a significant advantage. This support, however, was not without its own calculations. The emperor and his advisors were careful to ensure that their interests were paramount, their rewards secured. As the gears of preparation began to turn, the seeds of future conflict were already sown. The recruitment of captains, a vital step in assembling the fleet, became a subtle arena for these power dynamics. Men were chosen for their experience, yes, but also for their affiliations, their willingness to follow Magellan's lead, and their perceived loyalty to the Spanish crown. Many of these men, proud Castilians and Aragonese, harbored a quiet suspicion of Magellan, a Portuguese navigator proposing a venture that might seem to steal glory from their own nation. This simmering distrust would be a constant companion on the long voyage, a silent passenger aboard each vessel. The treaty signed years before, dividing the newly discovered world between Spain and Portugal, cast a long shadow over these discussions. The precise longitude of the Moluccas, the true source of the spices, was a matter of intense debate, a line drawn on a map that held the weight of nations. Magellan's conviction that his route would skirt Portuguese claims, placing the islands firmly within Spanish territory, was a critical part of his argument, a strategic gambit designed to appeal to the emperor's territorial ambitions. This geographical wrangling, played out in hushed tones and diplomatic exchanges, underscored the immense political stakes of the proposed voyage. The sheer ambition of the enterprise, the idea of sailing west to reach the east, was a concept that challenged conventional wisdom. Many believed the world to be far larger than Magellan's chart suggested, that the ocean was an impassable barrier, a vast expanse from which few, if any, returned. Yet Magellan, his mind honed by the precision of astronomical observation and the practicalities of seafaring, saw not an insurmountable obstacle, but a solvable puzzle. He held an unwavering belief in his calculations and the possibility of a westward route, a conviction that was both his greatest strength and, for some, a source of growing unease. The king, seeing the wheels of Spanish ambition turning with an almost unstoppable momentum, felt a pang of regret, a missed opportunity that now threatened to outflank his own nation's dominance. He had underestimated the tenacity of Magellan, the quiet fire that burned within the Portuguese captain after years of service had yielded little reward from his homeland. Now, this very ambition, nurtured by a rival court, was poised to challenge Portugal's hard-won supremacy on the seas. The allure of the spices, the promise of wealth and power, was a potent force, and it was being directed not towards Lisbon, but towards the burgeoning empire of Charles V. Thus, in the shadowed chambers of power and the sun-drenched ports of Andalusia, the stage was being set for a journey that would irrevocably alter the world's understanding of its own vastness. The king's decree, in a way, had been the catalyst, igniting a spark of defiance that, fanned by Spanish patronage, was about to set sail into the unknown, carrying with it the hopes, ambitions, and rivalries of kingdoms. Magellan, a man caught between two worlds, stood ready to embark on a quest that would test the limits of human endurance and the courage of those who dared to dream of a world not yet fully mapped. Around Seville, the familiar sounds of merchants hawking their wares and the distant cry of gulls continued their ancient rhythm, oblivious to the momentous decisions being made within the city walls. The clamor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda was a dizzying symphony to those who had sailed the great ocean's silence. Here, along the Guadalquivir River's edge, the king's fleet was being brought to life, each timber and rope a testament to the vast ambition that had driven them from Portugal and now, under a different banner, towards the edges of the known world. While a younger, restless Ferdinand Magellan moved through the crowds, his Portuguese heritage marked him, a subtle but persistent whisper of otherness in the ears of many gathered here. He felt the familiar weight of needing to prove himself, not just to the emperor, but to the very souls he now led. The port bustled with a feverish energy as the 5 ships, the stout Trinidad, the sturdy San Antonio, the nimble Concepcion, the swift Victoria, and the smaller caravel Santiago, underwent their final preparations. Men of diverse backgrounds, a rough tapestry of sailors, soldiers, and adventurers, were being gathered. They signed on for promises of riches beyond imagining, for the thrill of discovery, or simply for the chance to escape the hard lives they knew. Each sailor's eyes held a different story, yet all were drawn to the vast potential of this journey, a sentiment Magellan understood deeply, having felt the same pull for years. Among the seasoned captains chosen to sail with Magellan, a palpable tension simmered. Many hailed from Spain itself, and the thought of a Portuguese navigator leading them into uncharted waters did not sit well with their own pride. Juan de Cartagena, a man with a noble lineage and a sharp tongue, often made his reservations known. His glances towards Magellan spoke volumes, a silent challenge to the authority that had been granted, creating a rift that threatened to widen with every passing day. This undercurrent of dissent was as present as the creaking of the new timbers being fitted to the ships. The procurement of provisions was a painstaking process, each barrel and sack loaded with immense care. Mountains of hardtack, a dense biscuit meant to last for months, filled the ship's stores, alongside barrels of salted meat, a grim but necessary staple. Casks of wine and fresh water, vital for survival, were secured with equal diligence, though the sheer quantity needed for such an extended voyage always felt insufficient. Specialized navigational tools, like the astrolabe and quadrant, were checked and double-checked by those who understood the stars and the secrets they held to guiding them across the ocean's expanse. Magellan, accustomed to the efficient courts of Portugal, found the Spanish system and its many involved officials a complex dance of negotiation and compromise. He walked among the carpenters hammering at the hulls, the sailmakers stitching heavy canvas, and the rope makers coiling their sturdy wares, observing the intricate preparation. He saw the careful selection of every piece of equipment, knowing that the success of his audacious plan depended on the sound functioning of each element, from the largest mast to the smallest nail. Every detail was a crucial piece of a grand, unfolding puzzle. The crew members themselves formed a curious and often volatile mix. Some were hardened mariners, their faces etched by sun and sea, who had sailed familiar routes and understood the ocean's moods. Others were eager, perhaps foolish, adventurers, drawn by tales of spices and distant lands, their knowledge of the sea limited, but their spirit unbent. Magellan observed these groups, noting how readily some of the Spanish sailors gravitated towards captains like Cartagena, their whispers of doubt about his leadership seeming to find fertile ground among those who felt a stronger allegiance to their own countrymen. The sheer scale of the undertaking began to press in on all who were involved in its preparation. The king's decree had set them in motion, but bringing the fleet to readiness was a monumental task, testing the patience and resolve of everyone. The very air of Sanlúcar seemed alive with the buzz of activity, a prelude to the great voyage.
Magellan himself felt the keen pressure of time, knowing that the favorable winds for crossing the Atlantic would not wait, and that the whispers of discontent needed to be managed before they could fully bloom into open rebellion.
He often found himself standing by the water's edge, watching the ships, imagining the immense journey ahead. He saw not just wood and sail, but the key to unlocking a new route to the east, a path that would bypass the Portuguese territories and bring immense wealth to the Spanish crown. Yet he also felt the eyes upon him, the unspoken questions about his motives and his capabilities, a constant reminder of the authority challenges he faced. He wondered if the men truly understood the immensity of the task before them, or if they were merely swept up in the promise of glory and gold. This assembly of ships and men was more than just preparation. It was a microcosm of the larger ambitions and rivalries that defined their age. The procurement of every barrel of water and every pound of salted meat was a victory in itself, a small step forward against the vast unknowns. The tensions between captains, the hopes of the common sailor, and Magellan's unwavering resolve were all interwoven threads in the complex fabric of this burgeoning enterprise. The fleet was almost ready, a collection of disparate parts poised to become a single, formidable force. As the final casks were secured and the last sails inspected, a sense of anticipation settled over the port, thick as the scent of tar and salt. The challenge ahead was immense, the ocean a vast, untamed entity, and the loyalties of the men aboard were as shifting as the tides. Yet, for Magellan, the moment was also one of quiet determination. The fleet, this fragile yet powerful instrument of his vision, was finally taking shape, ready to face whatever lay beyond the horizon, and he felt the immense responsibility and the daunting odds settle upon his shoulders. The familiar yet unnerving roll of the ocean floor beneath the keel became the constant rhythm of life. Days bled into weeks as the 5 ships, the Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago, sliced through the immense, unyielding blue of the Atlantic. The initial burst of optimism that had filled Sanlúcar de Barrameda, a port town buzzing with the energy of departure, now seemed a distant memory, like the fading coastline they had left behind. The salt spray, a constant companion, coated every spar and sail, tasting of a brine that was becoming as familiar as the hardtack that formed the staple of their diet. This vastness, so full of promise on the charts, now felt like an overwhelming presence, a boundless expanse that seemed to swallow their hopes and their very identities. Aboard the Trinidad, Ferdinand Magellan, a man whose sharp eyes missed little, would often stand at the stern, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Beside him, João Cerrone, a stout Portuguese navigator with a weathered face, would trace lines on a rolled parchment. Their conversations, often conducted in hushed Portuguese, spoke of latitudes and longitudes, of the celestial bodies that guided them through the star-dusted nights. They discussed the subtle shifts in the wind, the way the waves seemed to predict approaching weather, for these were the languages of their survival. These shared moments of intense focus, of deciphering the ocean's secrets, forged a bond between them, a quiet understanding that transcended the simmering tensions elsewhere on the fleet. Meanwhile, across the other vessels, the mood was less unified. Juan de Cartagena, a nobleman appointed to command the San Antonio, found the Portuguese captain's authority increasingly irksome. He would often gather his own captains and trusted men, their voices low, questioning the wisdom of sailing so far from known lands. He chafed under Magellan's directives, his pride a constant, gnawing presence. The sheer scale of the undertaking, the dwindling supplies of fresh water, and the monotonous diet of salted meat and hard biscuits, a dense, dry bread that sometimes harbored weevils, began to wear down the crew's resolve. Each sunrise brought the same endless expanse of water,
and many began to wonder if the promised riches and glory were worth this relentless, soul-wearying journey. The routines aboard the ships became a desperate anchor against the overwhelming nature of the sea. Every man had his task, from the lowliest deckhand swabbing the deck to the skilled carpenters constantly tending to the aging timbers of the ships. The cooks worked tirelessly, trying to make the meager rations palatable, stirring thick, often bland stews over small, carefully managed fires. The sounds of the ship became a constant backdrop. The groaning of the wooden hulls as they met the waves, the snapping of canvas in the wind, and the occasional sharp cry of a seabird that circled them, a fleeting reminder of the distant land. Even the simple act of sharing a meal, huddled around a mess table, became a small ritual that helped ward off the creeping sense of isolation.
The navigators, their faces illuminated by the flickering lanterns below deck, spent hours poring over their charts and instruments. They used the astrolabe, a device that measured the angle of the stars above the horizon, and the quadrant, a tool for determining latitude, to plot their course. Their calculations were crucial, for any misstep could send them astray in this vast watery wilderness. The reliance on these ancient tools, combined with their own honed instincts, was a testament to the seamanship of the era. Yet, even with the most precise measurements, the ocean remained a capricious mistress, its currents and vast distances offering little margin for error. One squall, more violent than the others, struck with little warning. The sky turned a bruised purple, and winds tore at the sails with a fury that made the very timbers of the ships shriek. Water cascaded over the decks, drenching everything and everyone. Men scrambled to secure the rigging, their hands numb with cold, their faces grim. The ships pitched and rolled, each lurch threatening to send an unwary sailor tumbling into the churning sea. During these tempestuous hours, the fragile camaraderie of the crew was tested, as the shared danger forced them to rely on each other for survival, their individual grievances temporarily forgotten in the face of a common, overwhelming threat. Following the storm, a quiet, pervasive dampness settled over the fleet. Everything felt clammy to the touch, the ropes, the wooden planks, even the clothes on their backs. This constant moisture was more than just in discomfort. It was a breeding ground for mold and rot, a silent enemy working against the integrity of their vessels. The food, already dry, could become spoiled if not stored perfectly, and the air below deck could grow thick with the smell of bilge water and unwashed bodies. This persistent dampness became another subtle enemy, a constant drain on the men's energy and spirits, making each day feel heavier than the last. The monotony was broken by the sighting of distant land, a smudge of green on the horizon that brought a wave of relief. As they drew closer, they could make out the lush vegetation and the calls of exotic birds. This was the coast of Brazil, a land far richer and more vibrant than the desolate stretches they had endured for so long. The men eagerly lowered boats to row ashore, their bodies aching for the feel of solid ground and the taste of fresh fruit. While the abundance of nature offered a welcome respite from the privations of the sea, it also provided a stage for the growing friction between Magellan and some of his Spanish captains, their differing opinions on the next steps of their journey beginning to surface. Magellan, ever the forward-thinking commander, wished to press on southward, to continue the search for a westward passage around the continent. He believed they were on the cusp of a significant discovery, his faith in his charts and his own understanding of geography unwavering. However, men like Cartagena urged caution, their eyes scanning the vast ocean with a growing sense of unease. They questioned the wisdom of pushing into unknown waters with dwindling supplies and a crew already showing signs of weariness. These discussions, often held in the captain's cabin,
were laced with unspoken accusations and a deep-seated resentment, laying the groundwork for future discord. The sailors, for their part, observed these exchanges with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They knew that a decision made on board the flagship, the Trinidad, would affect them all. Some, buoyed by the brief taste of fresh provisions and the beauty of the Brazilian shore, felt emboldened by Magellan's resolve. Others, however, were beginning to listen to the whispers of doubt, their thoughts turning to home and the dangers that lay ahead. The promise of glory was a powerful lure, but the reality of the vast, unforgiving ocean was an even more potent force, shaping their perspectives and their loyalties.
As the ships prepared to sail south once more, the subtle tensions that had simmered since departure began to coalesce into a more tangible discontent. The sheer scale of the undertaking, the miles of ocean already traversed, and the uncertain path that lay ahead weighed heavily on the minds of many. They had set out with high hopes, but the Atlantic's immensity had a way of reducing such ambitions to mere specks against its endless blue. The familiar roll of the waves beneath their feet, once a symbol of progress, now felt like the relentless turning of a wheel, carrying them further into the unknown. In these quiet moments before the next leg of their journey, the crews could almost forget the growing anxieties about the voyage ahead. Weeks blurred into months as the salt spray became a constant companion, a fine mist that clung to clothes and skin, a reminder of the endless ocean surrounding the fleet. The initial exhilaration of departure had long since faded, replaced by the grinding reality of life aboard the San Antonio, the Conception, and the Victoria. Ferdinand Magellan, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, found himself increasingly at odds with the Spanish captains, particularly Juan de Cartagena, who openly questioned the wisdom of their southward course along the vast, unfamiliar coast. While the land offered glimpses of verdant green and the occasional flash of brightly colored birds, it also amplified the simmering resentments among the men. Many of them, accustomed to familiar Spanish ports, felt a deep unease sailing under a Portuguese commander, their loyalty often a fragile thing, easily swayed by whispers of doubt and perceived slights against their own nation's pride. The shores of what they would soon call Brazil presented a deceptive bounty. Lush foliage cascaded down to sandy beaches, and the air, though warm and humid, carried the refreshing scent of unfamiliar blossoms. Here, the crews found a welcome respite from the relentless sea, able to replenish their dwindling stores of water and gather edible fruits, a stark contrast to the monotonous biscuits and salted meat that formed the staple of their diet. Yet this temporary abundance did little to quell the growing friction between Magellan and his Spanish subordinates. Cartagena, his voice often carrying a sharp edge of authority, argued for a different approach, suggesting they explore the coast further, perhaps even consider turning back, a notion that met with Magellan's firm dismissal. He believed, with an unshakable conviction, that the passage they sought lay further south, a conviction that seemed to stem more from a deeply held navigational certainty than from readily available charts. Discussions about the proper course became more frequent, often spilling from the captain's cabin onto the open decks, where curious sailors, their faces etched with a mixture of weariness and apprehension, strained to hear. These conversations, filled with Latin phrases and navigational terms, represented more than just a disagreement on direction. They were a subtle challenge to Magellan's leadership, a testament to the divided loyalties that plagued the expedition. The very act of seeking a new route, a path to the lucrative Spice Islands that Portugal jealously guarded, meant navigating not only uncharted waters, but also the treacherous currents of human ambition and nationalistic pride. The men sensed the growing tension, the unspoken animosity that hung between Magellan and some of the captains, and the first tentative seeds of dissent began to sprout in the shadows of the ship's masts.
Magellan, a man whose life had been dedicated to understanding the vastness of the sea and the secrets held within the stars, felt the weight of these doubts press upon him. He understood the ingrained suspicion of his Portuguese heritage among some of the Spanish contingent, a suspicion that manifested in subtle gestures and veiled remarks. It was during these quiet hours, when the ship's lamps cast long dancing shadows, that he would pore over his charts, tracing lines with a calloused finger, his mind wrestling with the immense task ahead and the fragile unity of his command. The lure of the Spice Islands, laden with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, was a powerful motivator, a promise of wealth and glory that could reshape the known world. But it was a prize that required navigating not only physical dangers, but also the deep-seated rivalries within his own fleet. The abundance of the Brazilian coast, while a welcome relief, also served to highlight the differing priorities and ambitions of the men aboard the 5 ships. While Magellan remained resolute in his pursuit of a westward passage, some of the Spanish captains saw the land as an opportunity for different ventures, perhaps for trade or even colonization, which they believed should be led by their own countrymen. These diverging viewpoints fueled the interpersonal conflicts, creating an undercurrent of unease that permeated the fleet. The shared hardships of the journey thus far had forged a certain camaraderie among the sailors. Yet this nascent bond was constantly tested by the larger political and personal rivalries that played out on the quarterdeck. The very air aboard the ships seemed to thicken with unspoken accusations and suspicions, a prelude to more overt challenges. As they sailed further south, the lush greenery of Brazil gave way to more rugged, windswept coastlines. The land began to appear harsher, its embrace less welcoming, and the men, accustomed to the relative warmth of the northern latitudes, found themselves donning extra layers of wool and canvas. The ever-present wind, which had once seemed a benevolent force propelling them forward, now seemed to whip with a greater ferocity, snatching at the sails and making the timbers of the ships groan. This change in the environment, while physically challenging, also mirrored the escalating tensions within the fleet. The arguments between Magellan and Cartagena became more frequent and more heated, their voices sharp with frustration as they debated the best course of action. It was during this stretch of the voyage, as they explored a wide, inviting bay that seemed to promise a passage inland, that the full extent of the discontent among some of the Spanish captains became clear. Juan de Cartagena, his voice laced with an authority that bordered on defiance, openly questioned Magellan's navigational decisions and his perceived favoritism towards his own Portuguese officers. He voiced the unspoken thoughts of many of the Spanish sailors and captains, that their enterprise had been entrusted to the wrong man, that a Spaniard should be leading this monumental undertaking. The shared meals, once a time for quiet reflection or simple conversation, now often became arenas for thinly veiled criticisms and pointed remarks, each word carrying the weight of the deep-seated mistrust. The abundance of fresh water and edible plants found along the Brazilian coast had offered a brief reprieve from the gnawing hunger and thirst that had begun to set in. But this respite only served to highlight the underlying disagreements about their mission. Magellan's unwavering determination to continue southward, convinced that the strait to the Spice Islands lay ahead, was met with increasing skepticism from Cartagena and others, who were more cautious, more inclined to consolidate their findings, or even return to Spain with what they had already accomplished. This fundamental divergence in their objectives created a dangerous rift, a growing chasm that threatened to tear the expedition apart from within before it could even reach its most critical stages. The men aboard the ships, observing these exchanges, began to form their own opinions, aligning themselves with either the Portuguese captain's bold vision or the Spanish captain's more conservative counsel. The sheer length of the journey, the endless horizon of the vast ocean, began to take its toll on the sailors' morale.
Weeks at sea, with the monotonous routine of shipboard life and the constant, subtle anxieties about the unknown, had worn down even the most seasoned mariners. The limited space aboard the ships, the close proximity of so many men, amplified minor irritations into significant grievances, and it was into this fertile ground of discontent that the seeds of mutiny were sown. Whispers began to circulate through the tightly packed quarters, hushed conversations between sailors who felt overlooked or mistreated, their resentment stoked by the ongoing disputes between the captains. These clandestine meetings, held under the dim glow of lanterns, represented the first concrete signs of a rebellion brewing. Magellan, ever observant, could sense the shift in the mood of his crew. He saw the guarded glances, heard the hushed tones, and recognized the growing insubordination that was taking root. His Portuguese heritage, which had been a point of pride and a source of his unique knowledge, now seemed to be used as a weapon against him by his Spanish counterparts, who leveraged it to sow doubt and division amongst the men. The abundance of the land they had skirted, while a boon for their physical needs, had paradoxically weakened their resolve to press onward into the unknown, offering a tempting alternative to the arduous journey ahead. The choices faced by the men were becoming starker. Follow the singular vision of Magellan into ever greater peril, or heed the voices of dissent that promised a quicker, if less glorious, return. As they prepared to leave the Brazilian coast, the fleet's departure was shadowed by an undercurrent of defiance. The careful procurement of supplies, the meticulous checking of ropes and sails, all proceeded with the outward appearance of order, yet beneath the surface a profound distrust simmered. The crews of the various ships, each a microcosm of the expedition's larger divisions, found themselves drawn into these conflicts, their loyalties tested. Magellan, acutely aware of the precariousness of his position, understood that his leadership would require more than just navigational skill. It would demand an iron will and a willingness to confront the simmering discontent head-on. The vastness of the ocean ahead seemed to mirror the immensity of the challenge he faced in unifying his disparate crew and keeping them focused on their audacious goal.
The weight of the decisions made on shore pressed heavily upon the captains as they steered their ships southward. The sheer scale of the continent before them, an unbroken line of coast stretching into the hazy distance, offered both promise and foreboding. Magellan's conviction that a passage existed, a route to the lucrative Spice Islands, was a beacon, but the dissent from captains like Cartagena, fueled by pride and suspicion of the Portuguese commander, threatened to extinguish that light before it could even guide them. This deep-seated distrust, amplified by the weeks at sea and the strains of command, was a potent force capable of undermining the entire endeavor. The crew, observing these exchanges, began to gauge the strength of these opposing currents, their own resolve wavering with each unresolved argument that echoed across the decks. The land they sailed past, teeming with strange life and offering sustenance, became a silent witness to the growing rifts within the fleet, a stark reminder of the human elements that could prove as treacherous as any uncharted sea. The choices faced by Magellan and his captains were no longer solely about navigation. They were about loyalty, ambition, and the very survival of their unprecedented quest. The growing dissent had woven itself so completely into the fabric of their voyage. Bitter winds clawed at the rough-spun wool of the sailors' tunics as the Victoria, the San Antonio, Concepcion, and Trinidad pushed south along the vast, untamed coastline. The land itself seemed to recoil from the sea, presenting sheer cliffs and desolate plains that offered little comfort. Provisions, once plentiful, were now carefully measured, the hardtack growing harder and the salted meat often tasting of the brine that preserved it.
Each man felt the gnawing pangs of hunger, a constant companion on this journey into the unknown south. And the dwindling reserves sparked hushed conversations among the crew, their faces etched with worry as they watched the dwindling supplies being brought aboard from the shore. The growing descent had woven itself so completely into the fabric of their voyage. Bitter winds clawed at the rough-spun wool of the sailors' tunics as the Victoria, the San Antonio, Concepcion, and Trinidad pushed south along the vast, untamed coastline. The land itself seemed to recoil from the sea, presenting sheer cliffs and desolate plains that offered little comfort. Provisions, once plentiful, were now carefully measured, the hardtack growing harder and the salted meat often tasting of the brine that preserved it. Each man felt the gnawing pangs of hunger, a constant companion on this journey into the unknown south, and the dwindling reserves sparked hushed conversations among the crew, their faces etched with worry as they watched the dwindling supplies being brought aboard from the shore.
The harsh, wind-swept landscape provided scant relief from the growing anxieties aboard the ships. The region they found themselves in, a place that would later be spoken of with awe and dread, offered little sustenance for man or beast. The meager rations distributed each day were a stark reminder of how far they were from familiar lands, and the constant, biting wind seemed to strip away not only warmth but also hope. Men huddled together for shared heat, their breaths misting in the frigid air, and the lack of fresh food began to take its toll, leading to an almost constant weariness that settled deep in their bones, a weariness amplified by the sheer, unforgiving emptiness of the terrain. During a particularly severe spell, a tempest, born from the churning gray sea and the unforgiving skies, descended upon the fleet with savage fury. The Santiago, a smaller and more vulnerable caravel, was caught in the storm's unforgiving embrace. Its timbers groaned under the immense strain, and the ship was driven onto the jagged coastline, its hull splintering against the unforgiving rocks. The sight of the wreck sent a wave of dread through the remaining crews, a chilling reminder of the sea's immense power and their own precarious existence, even as they counted themselves fortunate to have weathered the storm with their own vessels intact. Magellan, however, displayed a resolve that surprised even those who had begun to doubt him. He did not despair at the loss of the Santiago. Instead, he marshaled the remaining men, organizing a perilous overland expedition to reach the survivors of the wreck, a testament to his unwavering commitment to his crew, even in the face of such disaster. They trekked for days across the desolate, wind-swept plains, battling the elements and the gnawing fear that they too might succumb to the unforgiving land, their progress marked by the struggle to find shelter and the constant threat of starvation in this desolate territory.
Yet, this period of extreme hardship and loss also served as the backdrop for a more insidious conflict, one that had been festering beneath the surface for weeks. At a place known as Port San Julian, the mutiny that had been a mere whisper in the previous months erupted into open rebellion. The Spanish captains, particularly Juan de Cartagena, fueled by resentment over Magellan's leadership and the prolonged search for a passage, seized control of 2 ships, their demands growing ever more strident. The audacious challenge to Magellan's authority shook the very foundations of the expedition, turning brother against brother in a desperate struggle for control. Magellan acted with swift and brutal efficiency to quell the rebellion, a move that cemented his reputation as a man of iron will and unwavering resolve. He orchestrated a daring maneuver, swiftly retaking the ships and imprisoning the ringleaders. The consequences for those who had dared to defy him were stark and severe, serving as a grim warning to any who might consider further dissent.
The swiftness and severity of his response left no doubt in anyone's mind that Magellan would brook no opposition to his vision, a chilling display that instilled both fear and a grudging respect among the remaining crew members. This decisive action brought a fragile order back to the fleet, though the memory of the rebellion lingered, a silent shadow over their continued journey. During the difficult days spent anchored in the lee of the Peloponnesian coast, waiting for the remnants of the storm to pass and the internal strife to subside, keen-eyed navigators began to notice peculiar features along the coastline. They observed vast inlets, deep bays that seemed to stretch inland as far as the eye could see, unlike the shallow indentations they had encountered before. These wide mouths of water, appearing at regular intervals, sparked a flicker of hope in their weary minds. They were beginning to suspect that these might not be mere bays, but rather signs of a far greater, continuous waterway, a passage that could pierce through the very continent.
This growing suspicion about a possible strait was discussed in hushed tones among the officers, a counterpoint to the more pressing concerns of dwindling provisions and the ever-present threat of the biting cold. Some believed these inlets were simply vast estuaries, doomed to lead only to impassable land. Others, however, pointed to the currents that seemed to flow from them, suggesting a connection to distant seas, a persistent rumor that had fueled Magellan's ambition from the outset. The exploration of these wide gulfs became their next urgent task, a gamble with their remaining resources and a desperate search for a path westward. The stark reality of dwindling supplies and the unforgiving nature of this southern land weighed heavily on everyone. The harsh climate and the scarcity of edible flora meant that fresh provisions were virtually non-existent. The men's rations, already meager, were further reduced to conserve what little they had, leading to a pervasive sense of hunger and a profound weariness that affected their spirits. The constant need to ration their food and water, coupled with the relentless wind, created a situation where survival itself became the primary, all-consuming concern for every man aboard the ships. As they continued to explore these promising inlets, the harshness of the environment tested their resolve. The constant wind whipped across the decks, carrying with it a chilling dampness that seeped into their very bones, making every task a struggle against the elements. The sea here was often turbulent, reflecting the volatile nature of the region itself. Despite the challenges, the relentless pursuit of a passage through the continent continued, a testament to the ambition that had driven them from the shores of Spain, even as the vastness of the unknown threatened to overwhelm them. The men worked with a grim determination, their hands often numb with cold as they adjusted sails and secured ropes against the persistent gusts. It was during this period of intense, focused effort that they began to notice a recurring pattern in the coastline's contours, a series of inlets that seemed to beckon them further south, each one wider and more promising than the last. While the grim fate of the Santiago remained a stark reminder of the dangers, the tantalizing hints of a continuous waterway ignited a renewed sense of purpose among the navigators, a feeling that they were on the cusp of a monumental discovery. As the Victoria's crew members prepared for the short rest before their next watch, the mournful cry of a distant seabird echoed across the desolate waters, a lonely sound in the vast, empty expanse. The days spent exploring the inlets along the southern coast had bled into weeks, each dead end chipping away at the men's resolve. The vast, unending gray of the ocean had given way to a stark, unforgiving coastline, a place of relentless winds that tore at the sails and chilled the very marrow of the crew. Many whispered that the passage they sought was a phantom, a legend spun by dreamers, and that their true course lay back towards the familiar Atlantic. Navigators, their faces etched with fatigue, unfurled charts under the flickering lantern light, tracing the coast with ink-stained fingers.
They debated currents, the angle of the stars, and the subtle shifts in the water's color. Each consultation a desperate plea for a sign, a hint of the way forward. The sheer difficulty of maneuvering the ships through these confined, churning waters demanded constant vigilance, with the ever-present threat of jagged rocks lurking beneath the surface. The frustration mounted with each failed attempt to pierce the continent's formidable barrier. The ships, having endured so much, were showing the strain, their timbers groaning under the assault of the waves and the relentless buffeting of the winds. A gnawing worry took root. What if this endless maze of bays and fjords was their prison, trapping them between the vast ocean they had crossed and the land that refused to yield its secrets? The crew, a collection of men who had left home for glory and riches, now found themselves mired in a frustrating, seemingly pointless quest. Their hearty rations, though carefully guarded, were becoming monotonous, and the constant dampness seeped into everything, making even the simplest task a sodden endeavor. This prolonged uncertainty, this inability to find the path forward, tested their spirits more than any storm had.
Then, a subtle change in the water's flow, a stronger current pushing seaward from a narrow opening, caught the attention of the keenest eyes. Magellan, his gaze fixed on this promising channel, felt a surge of conviction that this, at last, might be the passage they had risked everything to find. He ordered the fleet to turn, the ships inching towards the dark maw of this new waterway. The air here, confined by towering, rugged cliffs, felt different, carrying a damp, earthy scent of ancient rock and hardy coastal plants clinging to the sheer faces. The crew watched, a mixture of hope and apprehension warring on their faces, as the lead ship, the Trinidad, slipped into the unknown, its sails taut against the biting wind. The passage narrowed, its winding course like a serpent's path through the land. Sheer rock walls rose on either side, the sea's roar echoing back in a disorienting chorus. Navigators meticulously plotted each turn, their astrolabes and quadrants working overtime to gauge their position in this labyrinth. The familiar markers of the open ocean were gone, replaced by the stark, unforgiving contours of the land. The ships had to sail close to the shore, feeling the unfamiliar roll of the current pulling them, the spray from the waves crashing against the stone often reaching their faces. From the cliffs above, small figures watched their slow progress. They were a people adapted to this rugged terrain, their movements on the steep slopes surprisingly agile. The sailors caught glimpses of them, their forms silhouetted against the sky, their guttural calls drifting down the sheer rock faces. These were the Patagonians, whom the expedition had first encountered in more open lands, and their presence here, so close and yet so distant, added another layer to the expedition's profound isolation. The men aboard the ships offered no greeting, their focus entirely on the immediate life-or-death task of navigating the treacherous channel. They wondered if these watchers, living their lives by the rhythms of the tide and the seasons, understood the monumental effort unfolding below.
Days became a blur of arduous sailing, each bend in the waterway revealing only more of the same, a challenging, unforgiving landscape. Yet, with every league they pressed onward, the currents grew stronger, consistently drawing them westward, a powerful, undeniable pull that fueled the hope of finding the ocean beyond. The challenge was immense. A miscalculation, a moment of inattention, could send a ship crashing against the unforgiving stone. The crew worked with a grim determination, the rhythm of their labor dictated by the demands of the sea and the narrowness of the passage. The vastness of the ocean was no longer before them, but the embrace of the land was now tight, almost suffocating. The relentless effort began to take its toll. The constant strain of maneuvering, the cold dampness that permeated their clothes, and the gnawing uncertainty about what lay ahead wore down even the most seasoned sailors. They found brief moments of respite when the channel widened slightly, allowing them to anchor and perhaps secure a meager catch of fish, but these were fleeting pauses in the arduous journey. The memory of the open sea, of the vast, predictable horizon, seemed like a distant dream, a life from another existence. The sheer effort required to propel the ships forward against the swirling currents, to avoid the submerged rocks that seemed to appear without warning, demanded every ounce of their strength and focus. Then, the waterway began to widen, the sheer cliffs giving way to gentler slopes. The wind, which had been so fierce and unpredictable within the confines of the passage, began to change. It carried with it a different scent, a faint, salty aroma that spoke of a much larger body of water. The navigators, their faces alight with a dawning realization, pointed towards the horizon. The narrow channel, the labyrinth that had threatened to consume them, was finally yielding. A profound silence fell over the decks, broken only by the creak of the timbers and the distant cries of seabirds. They had found it, the passage, the elusive link between the two great oceans. As the Trinidad and the Victoria sailed out of the strait's embrace, a sight unfolded that stole the breath from their lungs. Before them lay an ocean of such immense, serene stillness that it seemed to stretch to the very edge of the world. The water was a deep, unbroken blue, calm and unmoving, a stark and welcome contrast to the churning turmoil they had endured. Magellan, his voice thick with emotion, named this tranquil sea the Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. This moment, after so many weeks of struggle and doubt, was a testament to their perseverance, a reward for their unwavering belief that a way through the continent existed. Yet, as the ship sailed further into this seemingly endless expanse, a new reality began to dawn. The vastness that brought relief also presented an immense challenge. There was no land in sight, no familiar coastline to guide them, only the unbroken curve of the horizon. The meager provisions they had managed to preserve through the ordeal of the strait seemed woefully inadequate for a journey across such an immense, empty sea. The sun, though not oppressive, cast a steady, unwavering warmth upon the decks, and the crew felt the familiar pangs of thirst begin to return, a grim reminder of their precarious situation. They had found their passage, but the true test of endurance, it seemed, was only just beginning. The initial jubilation over finding the strait gave way to a quiet, gnawing concern. The ships, now venturing into the heart of this vast, peaceful sea, were propelled by sails that filled with a steady, consistent breeze, a blessing after the chaotic winds of the coast. However, the sheer emptiness of the Pacific became a psychological burden. Days bled into weeks with no sign of land, no respite from the monotony of the endless blue. The meager supply of fresh water was rationed with an iron hand, and the taste of salted meat and hard tack, once merely unappetizing, now felt like a punishment. The men, their bodies accustomed to the physical exertion of navigating the strait, now faced a different kind of trial, the slow erosion of their spirits by the overwhelming scale of their surroundings and the dwindling hope of finding sustenance.
The quiet contemplation of the ocean's vastness was a welcome change from the navigational nightmares of the strait, offering a period of relative calm for the weary crew. Yet, this calm brought its own set of anxieties to the forefront, particularly the stark reality of their dwindling supplies. The ship's cooks, their faces grim, meticulously measured out portions of hard biscuits, often infested with tiny creatures, and the tough salted meat that had been their staple for months. The fresh water, once abundant, was now a precious commodity.
each man receiving only a small ration per day to stave off the worst of the thirst. This scarcity, coupled with the constant motion of the ship, led many to question how much longer they could endure such privations. As they ventured deeper into this vast, peaceful ocean, the navigators continued their painstaking work, charting their course with astrolabes and quadrants against the backdrop of the star-filled night sky. Their calculations, though precise, offered little comfort when the vastness of their journey became apparent. The constant rhythm of the ship's timbers, the vast expanse of water stretching in every direction, and the profound silence of the open sea began to wear on the men's spirits. The physical toll of the journey, the limited rations, and the absence of any land sights began to manifest in the weary expressions and subdued conversations among the crew. They sought solace in their routines, in the shared camaraderie born of shared hardship, and in the faint hope that their arduous search for a westward route would ultimately be rewarded with the riches of the Spice Islands. This period of seemingly endless sea was a profound test of their resolve, a quiet challenge that tested the very limits of human endurance and the strength of their collective will. The day's silent journey had left its mark, but life on the vast, uncharted ocean moved forward.
The labyrinth of the strait had spat them out, not into the open arms of salvation, but into a vast, serene emptiness that stretched beyond the farthest reach of vision. Ferdinand Magellan, his weathered face etched with a mixture of triumph and apprehension, surveyed the immense expanse. "Mar Pacifico," he declared, his voice carrying over the gentle murmur of the waves, a name that spoke of a hopeful calm, yet held within it the unspoken dread of the unknown depths ahead. For weeks, the ships had sailed across this placid, seemingly endless sea, a monotonous blue that offered no respite, no hint of land, and no alteration in the diet of hardtack biscuits, now more dust than food, and salted meat that had long lost its savory character. The dwindling provisions gnawed at the men as much as the gnawing emptiness of the horizon. Each sunrise brought the same unyielding vista of blue and sky, a constant reminder of their isolation. With each passing day, the sun's warmth, though not oppressive, brought a weariness that settled deep into their bones. The sailors, once boisterous and eager, grew quiet, their faces gaunt, their eyes reflecting the vast, unblinking sky. The simple act of eating, once a communal comfort, became a grim necessity, each bite a reminder of scarcity and the long, uncertain road ahead, a far cry from the bustling ports and familiar lands they had left behind. Navigation became a delicate dance of hope and calculation. The navigators, hunched over their astrolabes and quadrants, sought solace in the predictable arcs of the celestial bodies, their only guides in this featureless ocean. They traced their courses with trembling hands, measuring the tiny increments that represented leagues of watery void. The sheer scale of their undertaking began to weigh on them. The immensity of the Pacific felt like a tangible presence, a vast, indifferent entity that could swallow them whole without a trace. The constant, almost imperceptible roll of the ship beneath their feet became a monotonous rhythm against the unsettling stillness of the sea. The crew, a collection of men from diverse backgrounds, found their initial camaraderie tested by the relentless monotony and the growing shortages. Conversations dwindled to necessary commands or whispered anxieties. Some men spent their hours mending worn sails, their nimble fingers working with a practiced efficiency born of necessity, while others stared blankly at the endless horizon, lost in thoughts of home or the dwindling reserves of food. The few jokes shared were hushed, almost apologetic, lest they break the fragile spell of quiet endurance that had settled over the ship.
The desire for fresh water became a constant ache, a thirst that no amount of rationed liquid could truly quench. Men imagined streams flowing through verdant valleys, the cool, clear water a balm to their parched throats. The biscuits, riddled with weevils, offered little in the way of sustenance, and the salted meat was often too tough to chew, its flavor long since leached away into the briny depths. This scarcity bred a quiet tension among the men, a subtle shift in their interactions as each individual grappled with their own growing hunger and the fear that the provisions might not last. A peculiar stillness settled over the expedition during these weeks. Instead of the bracing winds of the Atlantic or the churning seas of the Strait, they now moved through a world of gentle swells and an almost ethereal quiet. The lack of strong winds meant the sails often hung limply, the ships gliding forward with a slow, deliberate momentum. This unnerving calm, while offering a welcome respite from violent storms, also amplified the feeling of being utterly adrift, a tiny speck in an ocean that seemed to have no end. Some men spoke of the sea as if it were holding its breath, waiting. The navigators, particularly the esteemed Rui Falero, spent long hours discussing the celestial alignments, their brows furrowed in concentration. They wondered if the charts, so reliable in other waters, held true for this immense, uncharted ocean. There was a palpable debate amongst them, not voiced loudly, but present in their shared glances and the earnestness of their discussions, about whether they had correctly navigated the vastness, or if unseen currents and variations in the Earth's magnetic pull might be leading them astray. This uncertainty, born from the sheer novelty of their surroundings, cast a subtle shadow over their scientific certainty.
It was during one of these long, quiet watches that a few of the crew members noticed peculiar, small birds unlike any they had seen before. These birds, with brightly colored plumage, seemed to flit in and out of existence, appearing suddenly and vanishing just as quickly. They were seen only briefly, often at a distance, and their presence, though fleeting, brought a flicker of curiosity to the weary faces of the sailors. One grizzled sailor, accustomed to the gulls of home, shook his head, muttering that they were sea sprites, tricks of the light born from too much staring at the sunlit water. The monotony was broken, ever so slightly, by the routine of shipboard life. The carpenters worked tirelessly, their hammers echoing softly as they secured loose planks and checked the integrity of the masts, their movements precise and economical. Sailmakers busied themselves with patching tears, their needles flashing in the dim light below deck, a testament to the constant wear and tear of the voyage. Even the simple act of preparing the meager meals, a task that fell to a few designated crew members, became a ritual, a familiar rhythm in the otherwise unpredictable journey. One evening, a hushed excitement rippled through the men. A sailor, perched high in the crow's nest, had pointed towards the horizon, his voice hoarse with disbelief. For a fleeting moment, a patch of darker blue, a smudge on the edge of their world, had appeared. Hope surged through the ship, a palpable wave of renewed energy. They strained their eyes, willing the distant speck to grow, to resolve into the reassuring shape of land, a place to replenish their stores and break the soul-numbing tedium. It was a fragile hope, a mirage that teased them with the promise of an end to their vast blue prison. As the days continued, that distant smudge remained elusive, perhaps a trick of the light, or perhaps a true island just beyond their reach. The great ocean, for all its apparent calm, remained a formidable, unconquered realm. The men continued their duties, their movements growing more deliberate, their gazes fixed on the horizon, always searching for the first sign that their journey across this placid, boundless expanse might finally be nearing its end. The relentless sameness of the sea had become the greatest adversary, a quiet, persistent challenge to their very will to endure.
The relentless Pacific crossing had become a slow, agonizing torment. Weeks blurred into a monotonous cycle of gray skies
and an unbroken horizon, each dawn bringing with it the same gnawing emptiness in the gut. The hardtack, once a sturdy biscuit, now crumbled into a dusty powder riddled with the tiny wriggling lives of weevils. And the salted meat, preserved through arduous labor, had taken on a rancid tang that clung to the back of the throat. Fresh water, a miracle of the ocean's bounty, was now a strictly rationed commodity. Each man allotted a meager cup per day, a cruel mockery of true thirst. It was during this extended period of deprivation that a terrible affliction began its insidious work among the sailors. A creeping weakness, starting as a dull ache in the limbs, progressed to a debilitating fatigue that made even the simplest tasks an immense effort. Gums became tender and bled at the slightest touch, a horrifying sight that few dared to acknowledge openly. These symptoms, the physical betrayals of their own bodies, reduced men who had once possessed the vigor of seasoned mariners to listless, hollow-eyed figures. The ship's cooks, their faces etched with worry, did what they could with the meager stores, desperately trying to coax some nourishment from spoiled provisions. But their efforts were often in vain against the relentless advance of this unseen enemy. The saltiness of the few remaining herbs and the sourness of whatever spoiled fruit they might still possess offered little defense against the disease's cruel grip. Each passing day saw more men succumb, their strength draining away as the vast, indifferent ocean stretched endlessly before them. Many of the afflicted found their bodies protesting every movement. The simple act of climbing the rigging became an impossibility. Those who had been the most robust, the strong backs that had hauled ropes and steered the great ship through treacherous waters, now lay prostrate, their once proud frames shrunken and frail. The air aboard the Victoria grew heavy not with any tangible mist, but with the palpable despair of men witnessing their shipmates slowly waste away. The grim reality of death aboard the ship took on a somber, practiced routine. As a man's breathing grew shallow and his eyes clouded over, his shipmates would gather, offering quiet prayers and the last sips of precious water. Then, wrapped in rough canvas, the body would be committed to the immense, unfathomable depths of the Pacific. This somber ritual, performed with a growing frequency, served as a stark reminder of their precarious existence and the immense forces arrayed against them on this lonely voyage. The physical deterioration was more than just visible. It was a constant, pervasive feeling throughout the remaining crew. Each man lived with the fear that the next day's ration might be insufficient, or that a sudden swell of the ship would dislodge some vital, if meager, supply. The ship's surgeons, men of practical knowledge but few effective remedies for this particular ailment, could only watch as the disease sapped the strength and spirit of their comrades. They observed the darkening of the gums and the loosening of teeth with a growing sense of helplessness. This extended period at sea, devoid of the fresh fruits and vital elements that sustained life, had created a perfect storm of deficiency. The ship's stores, once provisioned for months, had been stretched to an impossible degree, each barrel and sack emptied with a hope that was slowly being replaced by resignation. The men looked at the vast, shimmering expanse of the ocean, a boundless body of water that offered no sustenance, only an endless, taunting reminder of what they desperately needed but could not obtain. What was it like to face such a prolonged and devastating illness, with the vast, empty ocean as your only companion, and the remedies of your time proving utterly inadequate? The men found their thoughts turning to home, to the familiar fields and the comfort of settled ground, a stark contrast to the ceaseless motion of the ship and the pervasive sense of vulnerability. Their spirits, like their bodies, were being worn thin by the relentless trial. Despite the pervasive sickness, the vital task of maintaining the Victoria continued, albeit with fewer hands. The remaining able-bodied men, driven by a primal instinct for survival, continued their duties,
their movements slow and deliberate. They tended to the sails, patched the hull, and kept the ship afloat, each action a defiance against the overwhelming odds. Their efforts, though weakened by the same affliction that plagued their shipmates, were a testament to a deep-seated resilience. The constant hunger, the gnawing weakness, and the sight of friends succumbing to the unknown illness created a unique bond among the survivors. They shared their dwindling rations and offered what little comfort they could, each man a living testament to the human will to endure. Even as their bodies weakened, their spirits, though tested, clung to the faint hope of reaching land once more. The endless blue of the Pacific finally yielded to the sight of land, a vision that brought a surge of relief washing over the weary sailors. Green, vibrant shores, fringed with trees unlike any they had catalogued before, appeared on the horizon, promising a respite from the gnawing hunger and the constant, monotonous sway of the sea. This was a world bursting with life, a stark and welcome contrast to the desolate expanse they had traversed for so long, and the first of many islands that would offer succulence and sustenance to their depleted stores. As the ships dropped anchor in a shallow bay, small, swift canoes approached the massive wooden vessels, propelled by men whose skin caught the sun's rays with a bronze sheen. The islanders, their movements fluid and their features open, carried an air of simple curiosity rather than fear, observing the foreign craft and its occupants with wide, unblinking eyes. They brought offerings of unfamiliar fruits, their skins smooth and their flesh juicy, fruits that tasted of sunshine and rain, a veritable banquet after months of hardtack and rancid meat. And the crew eagerly traded simple metal trinkets for these vital gifts. The transactions, however, were often a dance of misinterpretation, as the value placed on a polished piece of metal or a brightly colored bead by the Europeans was met with a different understanding by the islanders, who saw the practical use of a well-made fishing net or a sharp chipped stone. The men aboard the Victoria felt a stir of wonder as they watched the islanders interact with one another, their language a melodic series of sounds that danced on the gentle breeze, a tongue utterly alien yet filled with an expressive rhythm. Children played near the shore, their laughter a clear counterpoint to the distant cry of unseen birds, while women tended to cooking fires, their movements practiced and economical. These people moved with a grace and an ease that spoke of a deep harmony with their surroundings, a way of life seemingly untouched by the complex, often fraught, political currents that had driven the Europeans across the vast ocean. It was a glimpse into a world where the rhythm of days was dictated by the sun and the tides, not by royal decrees or the pursuit of distant spices. A young sailor, barely a man, found himself watching a group of island women weaving intricate mats from dried leaves, their fingers moving with astonishing speed and precision. He wondered if their lives were as simple as they appeared, if their greatest concerns were the day's catch or the changing of the seasons, a quiet contrast to the anxieties that plagued the men aboard his ship. The fear of Portuguese patrols, the gnawing question of reaching home, and the lingering memory of fallen comrades. His own hands, calloused from rope and wood, felt clumsy and out of place in this serene setting, and he found himself envying the quiet purposefulness he observed. One of the expedition's officers, a man named Matteo, attempted to convey the purpose of their long journey to a village elder, using gestures and pointing towards the west, a rudimentary attempt at communication that met with a gentle, uncomprehending smile. The elder, in turn, offered Matteo a carved wooden effigy, its smooth surface cool against his palm, a gesture that Matteo felt was meant to convey welcome, though the true meaning remained a mystery. He tried to explain the concept of distant lands and the desire for trade, his words fumbling and his expressions earnest, but the elder's placid gaze suggested he perceived only the immediate presence of these strange visitors and their gleaming, peculiar possessions. This communication barrier, a constant undercurrent, highlighted the vast gulf between their worlds, a space that neither side could easily bridge with spoken words.
The crew learned that these islands, though seemingly idyllic, possessed their own intricate social structures and customs, as evidenced by the deference shown to certain individuals and the ritualistic manner in which some foods were prepared and shared. A small, almost comical misunderstanding occurred when the sailors, accustomed to communal meals, offered a shared bowl of stew to a group of islanders, only to discover that specific individuals were served from separate, distinct vessels. This detail, though minor, underscored the deep-seated differences in their social etiquette, a subtle reminder that their perceived notions of civilized behavior were unique to their own origins. A subtle debate about the best way to procure sufficient provisions began to form between the captains. There were whispers among the crew, particularly from those who resented any departure from their established routines, that the islanders' apparent hospitality might mask a more cautious or even deceptive intent. This unease, however, seemed to stem more from their own ingrained distrust of the unknown than from any overt signs of hostility from the island inhabitants. One sailor, a grizzled veteran named Rodrigo, grumbled about the potential for poisoned fruit or hidden traps, his words echoing the anxieties that had driven them through so many dangers, yet even he seemed swayed by the genuine generosity displayed in the offering of fresh water. The ships spent several days anchored near these tranquil shores, allowing the men to mend sails torn by the arduous Pacific crossing and to gather the vital supplies needed to continue their arduous voyage. During this period of relative calm, the sailors observed the islanders' simple yet effective fishing techniques, their spears darting with remarkable accuracy into the clear waters to catch silvery fish. This observation sparked conversations about their own dwindling stores of salted provisions and the dwindling hope of finding more familiar sustenance before reaching their next destination, highlighting the ongoing need for careful management of their remaining resources. The ships spent several days anchored near these tranquil shores, allowing the men to mend sails torn by the arduous Pacific crossing and to gather the vital supplies needed to continue their arduous voyage. During this period of relative calm, the sailors observed the islanders' simple yet effective fishing techniques, their spears darting with remarkable accuracy into the clear waters to catch silvery fish. This observation sparked conversations about their own dwindling stores of salted provisions and the dwindling hope of finding more familiar sustenance before reaching their next destination, highlighting the ongoing need for careful management of their remaining resources. The departure from these islands, though a relief from the uncertainty, carried with it a sense of melancholy. The crew had glimpsed a way of life so different from their own, a world where simple needs were met with readily available bounty, and where the anxieties of distant empires held no sway. As the anchors were raised and the ships turned once more towards the open sea, the islanders gathered on the shore, their figures silhouetted against the vibrant green of their homeland, a poignant farewell from a world they had briefly touched. In the growing twilight, the memory of the islanders' welcoming smiles and the taste of their sweet fruits lingered as the ships moved onward, carrying the day's experiences into the quiet of the coming night. The humid air pressed against their skin as the 5 ships dropped anchor in the sheltered bay of a Philippine island. For weeks, the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago had sailed across the vast, shimmering expanse of the Pacific, the endless blue a constant reminder of their isolation. Now, verdant hills rose from the sea, a promise of replenishment and a change from the salty monotony of their diet. The scent of unfamiliar blossoms drifted on the breeze, a stark contrast to the ever-present smell of brine and tar that clung to the ships. Sailors, gaunt and weather-beaten, scanned the shoreline with a mix of hope and trepidation, their days a continuous struggle against dwindling supplies and the gnawing anxieties of the unknown. Ferdinand Magellan, his dark eyes taking in the foreign land, saw not just a place for resupply, but an opportunity to solidify their position. He had navigated them through treacherous straits and across unimaginable distances, and now he sought to forge alliances, to spread the banners of their emperor and their faith. He spoke with his captains, their faces etched with a weariness that mirrored his own, yet their shared goal remained the acquisition of the precious spices that lay further east. The crews, a collection of men from many lands, murmured amongst themselves, their trust in their leader a fragile thing, easily eroded by hardship and the whispers of discontent that always seemed to find fertile ground amongst those far from home.
The local inhabitants of this island, who called their home Cebu, approached the colossal wooden vessels with a mixture of wonder and caution. Their own small outrigger canoes, crafted from local wood and powered by woven sails, seemed insignificant against the towering hulls of the European ships. They watched from a distance as men in strange metal garments disembarked, their armor glinting in the tropical sun. The newcomers carried long, thin objects that spat fire and smoke, and their voices carried a cadence unfamiliar to the islanders' ears. The exchanges that followed were a delicate dance of gestures and tentative offerings, each side attempting to decipher the intentions of the other across a vast gulf of customs and understanding. Magellan, always the strategist, aimed to establish his authority swiftly. He sought out the Raja of Cebu, Humaban, a powerful ruler in the region, and through a series of negotiations managed to secure a seemingly favorable agreement. The Raja, perhaps intrigued by the tales of the foreigners' power and their distant emperor, or perhaps seeing an advantage in allying with these formidable visitors, agreed to acknowledge their dominion and embrace their faith. The ceremony that followed, with the baptism of the Raja and his people, was a spectacle of glittering armor, colorful vestments, and the sonorous tones of unfamiliar prayers. Magellan felt a surge of triumph, believing he was not only charting new routes, but also extending the reach of his king and god. However, the islanders' acceptance was not universal, and a subtle undercurrent of unease began to ripple through the community. Not all the local leaders welcomed this new order. Near the island of Mactan, a smaller, more warlike chieftain named Lapu-Lapu refused to yield to Magellan's decree, or to acknowledge the authority of the Cebuano Raja. Lapu-Lapu, proud and defiant, viewed the foreigners as an intrusion, a threat to the traditions and autonomy of his people. He gathered his warriors, their bodies painted and their weapons fashioned from wood and sharpened stone, preparing to defend their way of life against any who would seek to impose their will upon them.
Magellan, affronted by this open defiance, and perhaps overconfident in the superiority of his men and their weaponry, saw Lapu-Lapu's resistance as a direct challenge to his command and the emperor's authority. He dismissed the concerns of some of his own captains, who cautioned against engaging a hostile force on their own unfamiliar shores with such a small contingent. The seasoned sailors, accustomed to the open sea and set-piece battles, harbored a quiet apprehension about fighting on land against warriors who knew every inch of the terrain and fought with a ferocity born of defending their homes. Their own numbers were depleted, and the tropical heat, though not overwhelming, was a constant drain on their energy. Despite these reservations, Magellan resolved to teach Lapu-Lapu a lesson. He led a force of approximately 60 of his men ashore, confident that their arquebuses, their swords, and their heavy armor would swiftly overcome the islanders' simpler defenses. The landing was fraught with difficulty. The shallow waters prevented the larger boats from reaching the beach directly, forcing the men to wade through the surf under a sky that promised no relief from the day's growing warmth. The air, though stirred by a gentle breeze, felt close,
carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the island's interior and the tang of the sea. As the Spanish soldiers advanced onto the sandy shore, the warriors of Lapu-Lapu emerged from the dense foliage, their war cries echoing through the trees. The initial volleys from the arquebuses, designed to sow confusion and fear, met with a resistance fiercer than anticipated. The islanders, nimble and accustomed to the terrain, moved with a speed that the heavily armored Europeans could not match. They dodged the shots, their wooden shields deflecting some of the smaller missiles, and pressed their attack with a relentless ferocity, using their spears and their long, curved knives to great effect.
Magellan fought bravely at the forefront, his voice raised in command, but the chaotic nature of the skirmish, the press of bodies, and the sheer number of islanders began to overwhelm his men. A searing pain in his leg, struck by a poisoned arrow, caused him to falter. As he struggled to stand, fighting off attackers with his sword, a warrior surged forward and struck him with a spear. Then another followed, their movements fluid and deadly. The familiar weight of his armor, once a source of protection, now became a hindrance as he was unable to escape the relentless onslaught. His own men, caught in the desperate melee, fought to reach their fallen leader, but the tide of the battle had turned decisively against them. The remaining Spaniards, witnessing the grim fate of their commander and realizing the hopelessness of their position, broke and fled towards their boats, leaving behind the fallen bodies of their comrades and their leader on the blood-soaked sand. The sheer ferocity and organization of Lapu-Lapu's warriors had proven far more formidable than Magellan had ever imagined. The islanders, their victory secured, remained on the shore, a silent testament to their courage and their fierce defense of their homeland. The surviving ships, their crews in shock and disarray, watched the unfolding tragedy from the water, their hearts heavy with the loss of their leader and the grim realization of their vulnerability in these distant lands. The precious cargo of spices, the ultimate prize, now seemed a distant dream, overshadowed by the immediate, devastating reality of their commander's demise. The expedition, so meticulously planned and so boldly undertaken, now faced an uncertain future, leaderless in the vast, unforgiving ocean. The remaining captains would have to find a way to recover from this devastating blow, to navigate not only the seas, but the complex currents of power and survival in a world far different from the one they had left behind. The hope of glory and immense wealth now felt incredibly fragile, balanced precariously against the harsh lessons learned on the shores of Mactan. The surviving leaders of the fleet gathered on the deck of the Victoria that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the water. The air, now cooler, carried the distant sounds of the island, the calls of night birds and the rustling of leaves, a stark contrast to the silence that had fallen over the Spanish sailors. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces grim, the enormity of their loss weighing heavily upon them. The path to the Spice Islands, the very reason for their arduous journey, now seemed a perilous and distant prospect. Who would now guide them? Whose command would they follow? The immediate concern was the safety of the remaining ships and their dwindling crews, and the difficult task of figuring out how to proceed without the man who had conceived and driven this entire audacious endeavor. The future of their voyage, and indeed their very lives, hung in a precarious balance. The Rajah of Cebu, witnessing the retreat of the foreign ships and the grim scene on the shore, found himself in a newly complex political landscape. His alliance with the newcomers, which had seemed so advantageous just days before, now appeared fraught with peril. The death of Magellan, the apparent leader of this powerful foreign contingent, left him in a position where he had to reassess his allegiances and his understanding of these distant peoples. The islanders who had sided with Magellan now looked to him for guidance, while those who had resisted, like Lapu-Lapu, might see this as a sign of weakness on his part.
The delicate balance of power on the island, which he had hoped to manipulate to his advantage, had been dramatically and violently disrupted by the arrival of these outsiders. This difficult turn of events would require careful consideration of how to proceed with the ultimate objective of reaching the lucrative Spice Islands. The remaining captains, bound by their oaths and the weight of the emperor's ambitions, would have to demonstrate resilience and adaptability. The spices, the driving force behind the entire enterprise, were still their goal, but the path to them had become infinitely more dangerous and uncertain. The shared experience of loss, while deeply painful, might also serve to forge a stronger unity among the survivors, forcing them to rely on each other in ways they had not before. The immediate future demanded practical decisions about resupplying, navigating, and securing the necessary provisions for the long journey ahead, all while grappling with the profound implications of their leader's fall.
The journey had become a tapestry, woven with weariness and the intoxicating scent of a prize finally within reach. After the long, agonizing crossing of the Pacific, the dwindling band aboard the Victoria found themselves navigating waters that hinted at the legendary wealth they sought. The Spice Islands, the Moluccas, were not merely a geographical destination. They represented the culmination of a world-spanning quest, a culmination that had cost them their beloved captain and countless companions. With Juan Sebastian Elcano now in command, the surviving navigators scanned the horizon for any sign of these fabled lands, their senses heightened by the knowledge that Portuguese ships, formidable rivals in the pursuit of eastern riches, patrolled these seas. The very air seemed to vibrate with a mixture of hope and apprehension. As they drew closer, the islands emerged from the sea mist like emerald jewels set in a sapphire sea. The air grew warmer, carrying the subtle, sweet fragrance of something exotic, a stark contrast to the brine and decay that had been their constant companions for so long. They arrived in the harbor of Tidore, a bustling hub where the allure of valuable spices drew traders from across the archipelago. The islanders here, accustomed to the comings and goings of ships, observed the battered Victoria with keen interest. The crew, a gaunt and ragged collection of survivors, felt a surge of relief mixed with a gnawing anxiety. They were finally here, yet the ever-present threat of discovery by the Portuguese hung over every interaction, making their procurement of the coveted cloves and nutmeg a perilous dance. The economic imperative that had driven this entire endeavor now demanded their utmost attention. And for the first time in months, the men of the Victoria saw a glimmer of true reward for their suffering. The islanders of Tidore, shrewd traders themselves, presented their wares, fragrant bundles of cloves and precious nutmeg, with a practiced air. The negotiations commenced, a delicate exchange where the Europeans offered European goods, their practicality and shine a novelty to the islanders, while the islanders sought a fair exchange for their highly prized commodities. The crew understood the immense value of what lay before them. These small aromatic seeds and dried flower buds were worth more than gold in the markets of Europe, a fact that fueled their determination to secure their cargo without attracting unwanted attention from the Portuguese, who considered these waters their exclusive domain. The weight of their goal pressed heavily upon the remaining sailors. The exhaustion from months at sea, compounded by the recent loss of Magellan and many experienced hands, meant that every task required immense effort. Elcano, burdened by the responsibility of leading the remnants of the expedition, oversaw the loading of the precious cargo. The sheer scarcity of their numbers was a stark reminder of the dangers they had faced, and the whispers among the crew spoke of the dwindling provisions that remained for the long journey home. Each sack of spices hoisted aboard felt like a step closer to salvation, yet also a heavier burden,
a tangible symbol of their arduous success and the perilous risks still ahead. The thought of failing to deliver this prize to their king after all they had endured was a prospect too bleak to contemplate. The presence of the Portuguese, though not immediately visible in their own ships, was a constant undercurrent of apprehension. Their established trading posts and naval patrols meant that any prolonged stay or overt display of wealth could invite immediate confrontation. Therefore, the dealings in Tidore were conducted with a degree of discretion, a quiet hum of activity rather than a grand celebration. The traders of Tidore, adept at navigating the complexities of inter-island commerce and aware of the rivalries between European powers, facilitated the exchange with a pragmatic efficiency. They understood that these foreign visitors sought to acquire their spices swiftly and depart before any unwelcome visitors arrived. The strategic importance of this venture, conceived in the halls of Spanish power, was now embodied in the sacks of spices being loaded onto the Victoria. This voyage was not merely a feat of exploration, it was a calculated move to outflank the Portuguese trade routes to the east, a daring attempt to claim a share of the immense profits generated by these exotic goods. The whispers of future voyages, fueled by the success of securing this cargo, began to circulate among the men. They knew that their return, if they survived, would reshape not only maps, but also the flow of wealth and power between distant continents, a testament to human ambition and the allure of spices that had captivated the world.
During these crucial days, a moment of unexpected humor pierced the pervasive tension. While supervising the final loading of clothes, a sailor, a wiry man named Mendez, known for his jests, accidentally dropped a small sack. The fragrant contents spilled onto the deck, and as Mendez scrambled to retrieve them, he tripped, landing with a comical splash in a half-filled barrel of brine. A wave of laughter, weak but genuine, rippled through the crew, a rare release of the pent-up stress. Even Elcano managed a small smile, appreciating the brief flicker of camaraderie that such a mishap could ignite among men who had seen so much hardship together. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit could find moments of levity. The underlying tension of this phase of the expedition, a pervasive fear of Portuguese interception, created a unique dynamic. The crew understood that their survival depended not just on their seamanship, but on their ability to disappear as quickly as they had arrived. The navigators studied the charts and currents, planning their departure with meticulous care, seeking to slip away unnoticed. This constant vigilance, this need for stealth, was a new element in their already arduous journey, a strategic necessity born of the intense competition for control over the lucrative spice trade. The wealth of the islands was tangible, yet the threat to claim it and to survive the journey home remained a sharp, ever-present danger. The arrival in Tidor and the subsequent procurement of spices represented a critical turning point, a tangible achievement after the long and often brutal stages of their circumnavigation. They had reached the fabled, a destination that had previously existed only in the realm of legend and distant rumor. The sheer remoteness of this place, the extraordinary distance they had traveled, underscored the magnitude of their accomplishment. The crew members, though diminished in number and physically spent, understood that they were witnesses to a world remade, a world where the perceived boundaries of the known had been shattered by their perseverance and daring. As the Victoria prepared to depart, its hold heavy with the fragrant cargo, the islanders of Tidor watched from the shore. They had witnessed the arrival of these strange, pale-skinned men and their massive wooden vessel, a fleeting encounter that would become part of their own oral histories. The seeds of cultural exchange, of a nascent global interconnectedness, had been sown. The crew, having successfully navigated the perils of the Pacific and now laden with the riches of the Spice Islands, looked towards the vast, unfamiliar expanse of the Indian Ocean, the ultimate challenge of their return journey looming before them.
They had the prize, but the long road home, a testament to the enduring scarcity of safe passage and the relentless demands of survival, still lay ahead, stretching into an uncertain future. Around the harbor of Tidor, the familiar sounds of daily life continued their ancient rhythm, largely indifferent to the monumental undertaking that had briefly touched their shores. The battered hull of the Victoria, no longer the proud ship that had left Spain, groaned under the strain of relentless waves. For months they had sailed onward, the vast Indian Ocean a churning, unpredictable expanse that offered no solace. Juan Sebastian Elcano, now master of this solitary vessel, felt the weariness deep within his bones, a weariness shared by the few dozen souls remaining aboard. Their journey back from the Spice Islands had been a brutal test of endurance. Each league gained against the sea a small victory against an overwhelming tide of exhaustion and dwindling hope. They were so close to home, yet the immensity of the waters still separating them felt as daunting as the initial departure. Their passage around Africa was a journey fraught with its own perils, a stark contrast to the earlier, more familiar waters of the Atlantic. The winds here often blew with a ferocity that threatened to tear their remaining sails to shreds, driving them relentlessly southward. Provisions, even the meager stores they had managed to secure in the Spice Islands, were once again running critically low, forcing the cooks to stretch every last scrap of dried meat and hardtack until it was little more than dust and worms. The salty spray, a constant companion, coated every surface, leaving a perpetual taste of brine on their lips and a clammy dampness that seeped into their very being, making each breath feel like an effort. The men, a spectral echo of the vibrant crew that had set sail, moved with a lethargic weariness born of prolonged hardship and a diet that offered little in the way of true sustenance. Their skin was stretched taut over gaunt frames, their eyes hollowed by hunger and the ceaseless strain of keeping watch. Elcano himself often found his thoughts drifting to the faces of those lost along the way, Magellan and so many others who had succumbed to disease, mutiny, or the unforgiving elements. He remembered the initial ambition that had fueled their voyage, the promise of glory and immense wealth, now overshadowed by the raw, desperate need to simply survive and reach familiar shores. As they navigated the treacherous waters off the southern tip of Africa, a place whispered about by seasoned mariners for its tempestuous nature, the crew braced themselves for the known challenges. The sea here seemed to churn with a particular fury, its waves rising like angry mountains, threatening to engulf their small ship. The constant creaking of timbers, the groan of the mast, and the snap of the rigging became a familiar, unsettling symphony of a ship pushed to its limits. Each sunrise brought not necessarily hope, but a renewed struggle against the elements and the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Throughout this harrowing passage, the specter of Portuguese patrols loomed large in their minds. These were lands they knew the Portuguese claimed as their own, and the sight of a lone Spanish vessel laden with coveted spices would undoubtedly invite unwelcome attention. Therefore, whenever the faintest shape of another sail appeared on the distant horizon, a tense quiet would fall over the Victoria, the men scanning the waters with a mixture of dread and a desperate hope that it might be a friendly vessel. More often than not, however, these distant shapes dissolved into the haze, or proved to be other ships unconcerned with their plight, leaving the survivors to continue their solitary journey.
The routine aboard the Victoria had become one of stark necessity and quiet perseverance. Mornings began before dawn with the changers of the watch huddled together for warmth, their faces etched with exhaustion. The work continued throughout the day, essential repairs to the ship, the mending of torn sails, and the meticulous rationing of water and food. Even the simplest tasks, like hauling a rope, demanded a significant physical toll on the weakened crew.
Elcano often had to rally their spirits with a few gruff words or a shared look of understanding for their shared plight. Their focus narrowed to the immediate task at hand, each day a step closer to home, the ultimate prize. Occasionally, glimpses of land offered a brief respite, a chance to perhaps replenish water stores or find meager sustenance. These landings, however, were always undertaken with caution, the men wary of the unknown shores and the potential dangers they might hold. The indigenous peoples they encountered were often as surprised by the appearance of the Victoria as the crew was by their lands. These interactions were usually fleeting, marked by a mixture of curiosity and a shared understanding of the harshness of the natural world rather than deep engagement. Such moments, though brief, served as a potent reminder of the vast, diverse world they were traversing. The constant exposure to the elements and the lack of proper nourishment continued to take a heavy toll on the remaining crew. Elcano noticed subtle changes in their behavior, a growing quietness, a profound sense of introspection that settled over them like a shroud. They spoke less of home, their conversations often revolving around the practicalities of the voyage or shared memories of their lost comrades. A deep camaraderie had formed among these survivors, forged in the crucible of shared suffering, a bond that transcended their earlier differences and the disparate regions of Spain from which they hailed.
The near-constant struggle for survival had stripped away many of the superficial concerns that had occupied their minds in the early days of the voyage. The meticulous charting of stars, once a point of pride and scientific endeavor, now served a purely practical purpose, guiding them homeward. The focus had shifted from exploration and discovery to the raw, fundamental drive to endure. Elcano found himself constantly assessing their dwindling resources, calculating the odds of reaching their destination, his mind a ledger of biscuits, water, and men. Yet, beneath the weariness, a flicker of determination remained, fueled by the memory of the Empress's unwavering support and the knowledge that their return would mark an event of profound significance. The spices they carried were not merely cargo, they were tangible proof of their incredible achievement. This understanding, though often unspoken, gave them a quiet resolve, a shared purpose that sustained them through the darkest hours. The vastness of the African continent, as they sailed along its coast, represented not just a geographical obstacle, but a final frontier to be conquered before the true journey home could be completed. As they finally rounded the southern tip of Africa, a region known for its unpredictable weather, the crew experienced a mixture of relief and apprehension. This was a significant milestone, a turning point in their arduous return voyage. The storms that had battered them on the eastern side of the continent still lingered in their minds, and the potential for encountering Portuguese ships remained a constant concern. Nevertheless, the sight of the westward-leading coastline offered a renewed sense of direction, a clear path toward the waters they knew would eventually lead them back to Spain. The approach to the Cape of Good Hope was a testament to the skill of Elcano and his navigators. They had studied charts, listened to the accounts of others, and now, with their own experience, they guided the Victoria through the challenging currents and winds that characterized this formidable headland. The effort required to sail past this point, battling the elements and the sheer distance, was immense, a final test of their endurance before the long, familiar sail across the Atlantic. The very air seemed charged with the immensity of the task they had undertaken and the hope of its successful conclusion.
The scent of salt and damp wood lingered as Elcano watched the setting sun paint the vast expanse of the ocean with hues of orange and red, the enduring memory of their perilous journey a constant companion. The Victoria, a shadow of the proud vessel that had set sail from San Luca de Barrameda 3 years prior, finally sighted the familiar shores of Spain. Her timbers, bleached by countless suns and battered by uncounted storms, groaned a weary song of survival. 18 men, a mere whisper of the original crew of over 200, clung to her decks, their bodies gaunt and their faces etched with the stark realities of a world traversed. They had endured the vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic, the treacherous winds of the African coast, and the gnawing emptiness that had stretched for months. This return, a stark testament to their tenacity, was met not with the fanfare expected of conquerors, but with a stunned silence that gradually gave way to a surge of disbelief and then profound awe. The first glimpse of land, a smudge on the horizon, had sparked a flicker of memory in the eyes of Juan Sebastian Elcano, the man who now steered their battered ship. He remembered the bustling port, the eager faces of those who had waved them off, and the implicit promise of riches and glory. Now, the faces of the few remaining sailors were a different story. They were the faces of men who had seen too much, endured too much, and paid a price far steeper than any coin could measure. A quiet solidarity had woven itself between these survivors, a bond forged in shared hunger, desperate prayers, and the grim necessity of placing one foot before the other, day after day, across the unyielding ocean. They were a community bound not by choice, but by the raw, unvarnished experience of being the sole carriers of an unbelievable truth. As the Victoria dropped anchor, the shore came alive with a mixture of hushed whispers and urgent shouts. People gathered, pointing at the skeletal ship and its spectral crew. The initial reception felt almost like an interrogation, a barrage of questions demanding to know the impossible. What had happened? Where were the others? And what strange cargo did they carry? The survivors, their voices rough from disuse and hardship, recounted tales that strained credulity, of vast oceans unseen, of continents passed over, and of a world circled in its entirety. They presented their precious cargo of cloves and nutmeg, the very reason for this perilous undertaking, their value now magnified by the immense cost of their acquisition. News of their return spread like wildfire through the ports and into the ears of the emperor's officials. The journey had been more than just a physical circumnavigation. It was a profound redefinition of the known world, a blow struck against the very boundaries of human understanding. The Emperor Charles V himself would eventually receive them, not in grand ceremony, but in a setting that allowed for the quiet, careful recording of their incredible odyssey. These surviving men, their bodies frail but their spirits tempered by unimaginable ordeal, were now tasked with the burden of conveying the sheer scale of their accomplishment, ensuring that the sacrifices made were not in vain, and that the knowledge gained would reshape the understanding of distant lands and the interconnectedness of the globe. The weight of their tale was immense, and the men found themselves the reluctant keepers of a secret that would alter maps and minds. They spoke of the vastness of the Pacific, a sea so immense it had tested the very limits of their endurance, and of the treacherous currents that pulled at their dwindling strength. They described the ingenious ways they had preserved dwindling provisions, turning water into a precious commodity and bread into a source of sustenance, however unappetizing. The meticulous work of the ship's carpenters, constantly patching the worn hull and repairing the torn sails, was a constant reminder of the ship's vulnerability against the elements. The men understood that their survival was a precarious balance of skill, luck, and an unyielding will to continue.
Among the many extraordinary accounts, the survivors shared observations of the islanders they had encountered, particularly the indigenous peoples of the Spice Islands, whose vibrant cultures and complex trading practices were a stark contrast to their own.
They recounted the intricate rituals surrounding the exchange of goods, the unspoken agreements, and the subtle cues that governed their interactions, highlighting a different kind of knowledge transmission that was passed down through generations. They explained that the cloves they carried were not merely a spice, but the culmination of a dangerous quest sought after for their aroma and flavor in faraway lands, a commodity that drove empires and fueled exploration. This very spice, they relayed, was the reason for the immense gamble they had taken. One curious detail that emerged from their accounts involved the peculiar practice of the islanders regarding their offerings of fresh fruit. Instead of consuming it immediately, the sailors observed that the locals would often bury some of the best produce, a custom that left the Europeans puzzled. This practice, it was later understood by those who studied their reports, was a way of honoring the earth that provided, a form of gratitude for the bounty. It offered a fleeting moment of shared humanity, a brief respite from the harsh realities of their journey, and a glimpse into customs so different from their own, prompting wonder about the myriad ways people found meaning and connection across the vastness of the world. The narrative of their journey also touched upon the ongoing discussions among learned individuals regarding the true shape of the world. For centuries, scholars had debated the size of the oceans and the possibility of a westward passage to the lucrative East. The survivors' direct experience, their meticulous charting of new seas, and the undeniable fact of their return provided irrefutable evidence that fundamentally altered these conversations. They had navigated through lands previously relegated to myth, and their tale, once transcribed and shared, would ignite new fervor for exploration, prompting further voyages and the creation of more accurate maps that reflected this newfound understanding of global geography.
As the surviving 18 settled into the familiar embrace of their homeland, a profound quiet descended upon them. The boisterous celebrations and endless questions began to fade, replaced by the gnawing absence of their lost comrades. They had witnessed the world from its edges, a perspective few could comprehend, and the shared experience had forged an unbreakable, albeit somber, connection between them. In these quiet moments, Elcano could almost forget the weight of the relentless Portuguese pursuit that had shadowed their every move across the eastern seas. The salt spray, a constant companion for months, had long since lost its sting, becoming just another texture on rough-spun tunics and weathered skin. The timbers of the Victoria, once proud and strong, now groaned with a weariness that mirrored the men who moved amongst them. Life aboard had settled into a rhythm dictated by the relentless sea and the dwindling stores, a cycle of survival punctuated by the mundane, yet vital tasks that kept the ship and its dwindling crew afloat. From the first hint of gray dawn until the stars emerged in the velvety blackness, the sailors moved with a practiced efficiency, each man's duty etched into his memory through endless repetition. A carpenter, his face a road map of sun and salt, painstakingly coaxed life back into a plank that had split under the strain of a particularly fierce squall weeks ago. The wood, once vibrant, was now bleached and brittle, but he worked with a quiet determination, knowing that this single piece held the integrity of their floating home. Nearby, a group of men hauled on ropes, their muscles straining as they adjusted the sails to catch the most favorable wind, their voices a low chorus of grunts and shouts against the endless sigh of the ocean. Every action, from the smallest knot tied to the largest sail unfurled, was a testament to their shared need to endure. The food, when it came, was always a stark affair. Biscuits, hard as stone and often riddled with tiny, scurrying weevils, formed the base of most meals. These were softened in water or wine, creating a gritty paste that filled the belly but offered little joy. Salted meat, preserved for months, was tough and stringy, its flavor long since leached away. Yet,
Even this meager fare was eaten with gratitude, each bite a reminder that they were still alive, still moving towards home, fueled by a simple, unyielding hope. Superstition, a quiet undercurrent in the lives of these men, manifested in small ritualistic gestures. A sailor might touch a carved charm before descending into the dark hold, or cast a nervous glance at a passing albatross, a bird considered a harbinger of good or ill fortune. Whispered prayers mingled with the creaking of the ship, as men sought protection from the vast, indifferent sea that held their fate in its depths. These practices were not mere foolishness to them. They were threads woven into the fabric of their existence, providing a sense of control in a world where so little was truly within their grasp. The smells of the ship were a potent, unchanging mixture. The sharp tang of brine mingled with the less pleasant odors of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the ever-present hint of rancid oil from the lamps. Even the cooking fires, meant to provide warmth and sustenance, added their own smoky, oily scent to the confined spaces. Yet, to these men, accustomed to the close quarters, these smells were as familiar as the rough texture of their worn woolens, a constant reminder of their shared journey. Sounds were equally pervasive and familiar. The endless creak and groan of the wooden hull, strained by the ocean's swell, provided a constant backdrop. The snap and rustle of the sails, the slap of waves against the hull, and the cries of the few seabirds that occasionally followed their path were the only natural sounds to break the monotony. The low murmur of voices, the rhythmic pull of oars when the wind died, and the occasional clang of a tool against metal were the human sounds that filled the spaces between these natural melodies.
Personal space was a luxury none could afford. Men slept in hammocks slung close together in the cramped quarters below deck, their bodies pressed against one another for warmth and comfort. The rough weave of their garments, though practical, chafed against the skin, a constant, low-grade irritation. Even simple tasks like mending a tear in a shirt became an intimate act, performed in shared, dimly lit spaces where privacy was an alien concept. The skilled hands of the sailmakers worked tirelessly, patching and reinforcing the vast canvas that propelled them forward. Each stitch was deliberate, each repair a small victory against the elements that sought to tear their lifeline apart. Similarly, the shipwrights, with their knowledge of wood and timber, worked to keep the hull sound, ensuring that the relentless gnawing of the sea did not breach their sanctuary. Their expertise was as vital to survival as any captain's command. Despite the hardships, a unique form of camaraderie had developed among the survivors. They had faced death together, shared the meager rations, and relied on each other for strength when their own failed. This bond, forged in the crucible of their extraordinary voyage, transcended national origins or past differences. They were a brotherhood of the sea, united by their shared ordeal and the distant hope of reaching familiar shores. The sheer effort required for even the simplest tasks was a constant reminder of their weakened state. Lifting a cask of water, hoisting a coil of rope, or even just walking across the pitching deck demanded a significant expenditure of energy. Each movement was calculated, each step mindful of the ever-present risk of losing one's footing and tumbling into the vast, uncaring ocean that lay just beyond the weathered rails of their fragile vessel. The vastness of their journey had taught them a profound humility, a deep respect for the forces of nature that governed their existence. They understood that their survival depended not on their own strength alone, but on a delicate balance of skill, preparation, and a touch of fortune.
The resilience they displayed day after day was born not of arrogance, but of a deep-seated need to endure, to see the end of their arduous path, and to recount the tales of their unbelievable voyage.
As the horizon remained stubbornly empty, the men found solace in the simple, repetitive tasks that defined their days. The constant hum of activity, the shared purpose of keeping the Victoria afloat and moving, had woven itself so completely into their world that the idea of any other existence seemed impossibly distant. The days in the islands, after the ships of the Great Fleet first appeared like white birds on the distant water, were filled with a new kind of rhythm. For the people of these shores, accustomed to the predictable rise and fall of the tide and the familiar calls of the jungle birds, the arrival of these towering wooden structures and their pale-skinned occupants was an event that stirred both wonder and a deep-seated unease. Small fishing canoes, swift and nimble, had been the first to approach, their crews paddling with practiced strokes, their movements a dance of shared understanding honed over generations. They observed the foreigners from a respectful distance, their eyes wide, taking in the strange clothing, the bearded faces, and the glint of metal from tools and weapons unlike any they had ever fashioned. A ripple of apprehension spread through the villages as the large vessels anchored closer to the shore, their immense size dwarfing the humble dwellings clustered near the water's edge. The air, usually alive with the calls of unseen creatures and the murmur of daily tasks, now held a new sound, the foreign shouts of the men who disembarked, their voices carrying an unfamiliar cadence. Children, usually bold in their curiosity, clung to their mothers, their gazes fixed on these impossibly tall men who moved with a heavy gait, their presence disrupting the natural harmony of their world. They watched as the newcomers, with gestures and sounds that were utterly alien, began to explore the edges of their lands, touching the smooth, cool bark of trees and examining the vibrant colors of the flowers with a strange intensity. These early encounters were a tapestry of bewilderment and cautious interaction, a dance of misunderstanding played out under a sky that had witnessed so many centuries of predictable change. Gifts were exchanged, though the true value of what was offered and received remained a matter of guesswork, like trying to decipher a dream upon waking. The islanders offered fresh water from gourds, sweet fruits that burst with flavor, and woven mats of exquisite design, simple treasures imbued with the artistry of their hands and the bounty of their environment. In return, they received small, gleaming objects, beads of colored glass that caught the light, and strips of metal that, while curious, held no practical use in their daily lives, their true purpose a mystery. A subtle disruption began to weave its way into the fabric of their communities, a change that was not immediately understood, but felt in the shifting currents of their days. The foreigners, in their attempts to convey their intentions, often used forceful gestures and loud voices, their impatience evident in their hurried movements. When they sought to gather provisions, they sometimes took more than was offered, their actions guided by an urgency that seemed to stem from a deeper, unseen need. A stark contrast to the islanders' practice of taking only what was necessary. This was not malice, perhaps, but a fundamental difference in how they perceived ownership and the abundance of the world around them. The presence of illness, a more insidious consequence of these new arrivals, soon became a quiet concern whispered among the elders. Before these ships, fevers were rare, and ailments were often understood through the wisdom of traditional healers, their remedies drawn from the plants and herbs of their homeland. Now a strange lethargy afflicted some, a cough that lingered,
and a weakness that no amount of rest or familiar tonics could dispel. It was a new kind of sickness, one that seemed to spread with an unseen breath, a shadow cast by the very presence of the outsiders, a testament to the delicate balance of the world and how easily it could be upset.
Across the vast expanse of water, the memory of the giants encountered in the southern lands still lingered in the tales shared by the few who had seen them. The Patagonians, tall and imposing, had viewed the foreign sailors with a mixture of awe and suspicion when their ships first appeared, marveling at the impossibly pale skin that seemed to absorb the very light. Their initial interactions had been marked by the sharing of food, the offering of warm cloaks woven from the wool of their domesticated animals, and the careful observation of each other's customs, a stark contrast to the more fleeting transactional exchanges seen later. Yet, even in those distant, wind-swept plains, the seeds of change were subtly sown. The arrival of the ships, though brief, left behind an imprint that would be pondered for seasons to come. The curious metal objects that had been traded, the echoes of the visitors' strange songs, and the sheer novelty of such an encounter reshaped the elders' stories and the children's games. For many, these encounters were like fleeting dreams, vivid and impactful, but the true breadth of their meaning would only unfold with the passage of time, as the world beyond their shores began to reveal itself in ways previously unimagined. On the islands of the far west, where the air was often filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers, the perception of the newcomers varied greatly. Some communities welcomed them with open arms, intrigued by their stories and the gifts they brought, seeing them as visitors from a distant, perhaps mythical land. Others, however, felt a growing sense of unease, their ancient ways challenged by the foreigners' assertive presence and their attempts to impose new beliefs and customs, often accompanied by veiled threats or the demonstration of superior weaponry. The concept of different gods and different ways of living began to weave a complex thread through their own established traditions.
The disruption was not always immediate or obvious. It manifested in subtle shifts, a newfound desire for the traded glass beads over the carefully crafted shell necklaces, a growing curiosity about the foreigners' maps and navigational tools, which hinted at a world far larger than their own. The impact of introduced diseases, carried unknowingly by the sailors, began to whittle away at the edges of communities, leaving gaps in their collective knowledge and their ability to perform their age-old rituals. This slow erosion of their existing order, a consequence of their contact with the outside world, was a silent testament to the far-reaching effects of this ambitious voyage. This gradual alteration of their societies was a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of all peoples, however distant. The arrival of a single fleet, driven by the ambitions of kings and captains, sent ripples across oceans and continents, altering the lives of those who had never imagined such beings existed. The stories that had once been confined to the boundaries of their own lands now began to intertwine with the tales of these new arrivals, creating a shared history, albeit one marked by profound misunderstandings and the undeniable force of change. The world for them was irrevocably expanding. For the people of the islands, the great wooden ships were more than just vessels. They were harbingers of a new era. The gleaming metal of their tools and the strange fabrics of their clothing spoke of a different kind of existence, one that was both intriguing and unsettling. When a local chieftain, proud of his domain and his people, resisted the foreigners' demands, the consequences were swift and brutal, a harsh lesson in the power imbalance that now existed. The clash that followed, though brief, left an indelible mark,
a stark illustration of how quickly cultural exchanges could devolve into conflict when mutual understanding faltered. The world for them was irrevocably expanding. For the people of the islands, the great wooden ships were more than just vessels. They were harbingers of a new era. The gleaming metal of their tools and the strange fabrics of their clothing spoke of a different kind of existence, one that was both intriguing and unsettling. When a local chieftain, proud of his domain and his people, resisted the foreigner's demands, the consequences were swift and brutal, a harsh lesson in the power imbalance that now existed. The clash that followed, though brief, left an indelible mark, a stark illustration of how quickly cultural exchanges could devolve into conflict when mutual understanding faltered.
The whispers of these encounters, like fallen leaves carried on the wind, began to spread. From the vast open plains where the first tall visitors were seen, to the verdant islands where the sea offered both bounty and unexpected peril, the echoes of the great fleet's passage continued to resonate. The shared experience of these encounters, though viewed through vastly different lenses, wove a new narrative into the human story, one that spoke of both the enduring curiosity that drove exploration and the complex, often difficult, consequences that followed when worlds collided. As the last of the foreign ships sailed beyond the horizon, leaving behind a subtle quietude, the islanders began the slow process of re-establishing their familiar rhythms. The stories of the visitors, however, would not be easily forgotten. They would be recounted around evening fires, shaping the understanding of the world and its possibilities, a tangible reminder of the day the sea brought strangers from beyond the edge of their known world. The tools felt familiar in their hands as they resumed their fishing, but a new question lingered in their minds, a quiet hum about the vastness that lay beyond the familiar shores. The world, once a known entity stretching from familiar shores to distant hazy horizons, began to reshape itself in the minds of those who watched the battered Victoria finally drop anchor. The maps held in royal chambers, painstakingly drawn with the best available knowledge, now seemed incomplete, almost childish, to the men who had sailed beyond their edges. This single voyage, a testament to both human daring and profound suffering, had undeniably redrawn the boundaries of what people understood their planet to be. The very idea that one could sail in a continuous circle, returning to the point of origin from the opposite direction, shifted the foundations of learning and exploration that had stood for centuries. The rigorous process of charting this new reality began almost immediately upon the ship's arrival, its timbers groaning from the strain of countless leagues. Navigators, poring over logs filled with observations of unfamiliar stars and the strange dance of ocean currents, found their calculations tested and their understanding challenged by the sheer scale of the journey. They meticulously recorded the positions of newly encountered lands, sketching coastlines and noting prevailing winds, seeking to fit the chaotic reality of their voyage onto the ordered grids of existing maps. This work was not merely about documenting geography. It was about re-establishing a sense of control and comprehension over a world suddenly revealed to be far larger and more complex than previously imagined. The emperor himself, receiving news of the Victoria's return, saw the immense value in the hard-won knowledge now held by the few surviving sailors. Discussions filled the halls of power, not about the usual rivalries, but about the practical implications of this circumnavigation for trade, for dominion, and for the very expansion of empire. The spices carried in the Victoria's hold, though few, represented a tangible prize. But the true treasure was the demonstrated possibility of a western passage to the east, bypassing the established routes controlled by others. This knowledge sparked a fresh wave of planning, with the promise of future expeditions and the desire to map these newly charted waters with greater precision and purpose.
Across the continent, whispers of the journey began to travel, carried by merchants and travelers, slowly filtering into the lives of ordinary people. The notion that the Earth was a sphere and that it could be entirely traversed ignited imaginations and spurred curiosity. For many, the world had been a place of fixed lands and divine order, but the accounts of men who sailed beyond the known edges, who endured unimaginable hardships to prove a concept, offered a new perspective. This burgeoning understanding began to sow the seeds for a generation of explorers who would take up the challenge, driven by the very example of the Victoria's return, their own ambitions fueled by the audacity of those who had gone before.
The advancements in the tools used for navigation, though perhaps subtle to the uninitiated, were profound. The astrolabe, used to measure the angle of celestial bodies above the horizon, and the quadrant, serving a similar purpose, were instruments of great skill. The long months at sea had provided unprecedented opportunities to test and refine the methods of celestial navigation, proving their worth in the most demanding conditions imaginable. Sailors learned to better interpret the subtle shifts in the stars' positions, to account for the Earth's curvature with greater accuracy, and to rely on these instruments not just for direction, but for survival across vast, featureless expanses of ocean. The economic consequences of this single voyage were already beginning to ripple outwards, fundamentally altering perceptions of global commerce. The arduous journey to secure spices, a commodity highly prized for its flavor, fragrance, and preservative qualities, demonstrated the potential wealth to be gained by controlling direct trade routes. This success would inevitably lead to increased competition and further voyages aimed at securing these lucrative markets, reshaping the economic landscape for kingdoms and merchants alike. The path taken by the Victoria offered a tangible alternative to existing overland and sea routes, prompting a reevaluation of established trade monopolies. The journey also underscored the limitations of existing knowledge, pushing the boundaries of what was understood about shipbuilding and seafaring. The constant need to repair the aging ships, to adapt to unfamiliar weather patterns, and to carry a finite amount of provisions highlighted the practical challenges of long-distance oceanic travel. This experience would inform future designs, encouraging the development of sturdier hulls, more efficient sail configurations, and improved methods for preserving food and water. Each innovation a direct response to the hardships faced by Magellan and his crew. The very resilience of the Victoria itself became a testament to human ingenuity in the face of extreme conditions. Furthermore, the interaction with diverse cultures encountered along the way, from the indigenous peoples of South America to the inhabitants of the scattered islands of the Pacific, offered a glimpse into a world far more varied than many had believed. While the primary goal was trade and navigation, the encounters inevitably left an imprint on both the travelers and the visited communities, introducing new ideas, customs, and even diseases. The simple act of observing different ways of life, of attempting communication across vast cultural divides, broadened the horizons of the sailors, and, through their eventual accounts, began to expand the collective understanding of humanity's global tapestry. Looking back at the journey, one might ponder how such an undertaking, born of ambition and fraught with unimaginable peril, could so thoroughly remake the world. It wasn't merely the geographical revelation, but the demonstration of sheer human capacity to endure and to achieve the seemingly impossible. The courage of those who faced mutiny, starvation, and the unforgiving sea to push beyond the known horizon offered a powerful narrative that would resonate for generations. The very act of circumnavigation became a symbol of human progress, a testament to the relentless drive to explore, to understand, and to connect.
The echoes of this voyage would continue to resonate for centuries, shaping the course of history, exploration, and global understanding. The hard-won knowledge, etched onto maps and into the memories of a few survivors, had fundamentally altered humanity's perception of its place in the cosmos. The world had, in essence, been made anew through the eyes of those who dared to sail its entirety, proving that the greatest discoveries often lay just beyond the edge of what was believed to be possible. The day's endeavors in recounting such a monumental feat had left their mark, but life in the great cities and quiet villages continued, now aware of a vastly expanded world.
As we conclude our journey through the epic voyage of Magellan's circumnavigation, let the vastness of that ancient quest cradle you into slumber. Imagine the stillness of the open ocean after weeks at sea, the hopeful quiet as the San Antonio finally sighted the shores of the Philippines, a new horizon unfurled. This grand exploration, a testament to human perseverance, reminds us that even the longest voyages eventually find their peaceful harbor. Let the spirit of discovery that guided those brave souls now guide your own dreams. May your rest be as deep and as undisturbed as the quiet waters of a sheltered bay. Drift off now, knowing the world has been mapped and is ready for your own quiet contemplation. Sleep soundly, travelers of the night.